Hello, welcome to our session on Judaism. My name is Patrick De Silva, and I'll be your host for this installment of our series talking about religion, sponsored by Pitkin County Senior Services. Let's get started. So, talking about Judaism, I think it's good to begin with scripture, and that's sort of how I'll be organizing most of the presentations that I'm doing as part of this series. With Judaism, the main scripture is the Tanakh. Here, I have it broken down into three sections because this actually is a little bit of an acronym. So the Ta stands for Torah, meaning the teachings found in Hebrew scripture, and this constitutes the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The Na refers to Nevi'im, who are the prophets, so examples would be Jeremiah and Isaiah. And then the Ha is Chetuvim, or the writings, things like Proverbs and the Psalms. So the tradition holds that there are some 613 commandments, or mitzvot, found in the Torah. Now, these are subject to centuries of debate and interpretation, which is what we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which I've referenced here in the slide. This history of interpretation and reinterpretation and reinterpretation is central to what the rabbis, the religious scholars, and teachers engage in. So, just like other religious traditions, there's an incredible amount of diversity with regards to how people understand Scripture. Should a passage be understood as literal, i.e., is God literally appearing to Moses as a burning bush, or metaphorical? Do we understand that reference to God as a burning bush as Moses felt incredibly close to God? How do we gloss that? And you're going to see that as sort of a spectrum in what we might call scriptural reasoning that we can engage in with all the traditions that we're going to be talking about in this series. So the Tanakh is written almost completely in Hebrew with a few passages in Aramaic. The Tanakh contains a great deal of religious history, outlining the Jewish community's experience from the literal moment of the world's creation, right, in Genesis, in the beginning, all the way through the escape from slavery in Egypt, depicted in Exodus, to an incredibly rich history of God working through a series of prophets to guide this community back to worshiping Him if and when they stray. This is actually something that I think marks it as distinctive if we look at world religious traditions, that this scriptural tradition does have a very clear sense of linearity. There is a historical narrative. The way it's organized is, roughly speaking, chronologically. And we'll look at other scriptures that aren't organized in quite the same way. Okay, let's proceed. After talking about scripture, I think another great place to look is is Judaism divided up into various denominations. So I've laid out here, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. And the Reform movement actually starts in Europe, and I think we could classify it as part of this religious or change in religious affect and being that we could link to the Enlightenment period. And so this picture here is of Rabbi Denise Eger of Congregation Kol Ami, a Reformed synagogue in Los Angeles. Rabbi Eger is actually the first openly gay president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinical sort of group within Reform Judaism. So Reform Judaism is known as, through its history over the last several centuries, being more and more open to engaging in different interpretations that we might classify as progressive. Um, while today there are Orthodox rabbis who are women, um, that's a much more recent phenomenon as compared to in the Reform tradition. Um, if we look at the Orthodox movement as sort of being the what most people would classify as basically all of Judaism until this like 17th, 18th, in the 19th century when we get the Reform movement. Um, Orthodox then Judaism we would classify as uh, one still very important denomination. And then we have the conservative movement, which is sort of a reaction to the Reform movement. So some people think that it's, Orthodox and then conservative and then Reform in terms of a chronology, but it's actually sort of Orthodox and then Reform and then conservative. I did find some interesting statistics about addressing kind of like gender and actually also political affiliation within the rabbinate in these different denominations. So let's see, let me pull it up here. So 45% of Reform rabbis are women, as opposed to an average of 16% across denominations in the United States, not just within Jewish communities, but across all other religious traditions and denominations. About a quarter of conservative rabbis are women, and nearly all Orthodox clergy are men. Um, and so that right there, I think, brings us to this intersection of gender and religious tradition. Um, we see these divisions according to denomination. Now, you'll also notice under Orthodox, I have Hasidic. So, Hasidism is a subsect of Orthodox Judaism, and we could call it a spiritual revivalist movement dating back to roughly the 19th century in Eastern Europe. Um, there's an Orthodox movement that you may have heard of called Chabad, which dates back roughly 200 years. It's become very popular recently, operates centers all over the world, including several in Colorado, Denver, Boulder, and there's one in Pitkin County near you. So that would be an opportunity to learn more about these different denominations and how they stand on not just this key issue of women in leadership positions, but you could look at positions on the importance of keeping kosher, that is, like following the dietary laws that are laid out in the Tanakh, um, and so on and so forth. I think this is one way to learn more about the diversity within all of the religious traditions that we're talking about in this series. Is when you get, you get the label of Judaism or Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, you find these different movements within that group that operate under the umbrella of, in this case, Judaism, and you learn how they're all different. So, okay, let's move on. Uh, one ritual that I think is very important within Judaism is the bar or bat mitzvah. So for we'll call it a young man, a bar mitzvah, and for a young woman, a bat mitzvah. One of the more well-known coming of age rituals where Jewish young men and women demonstrate their ability to fully participate in the community's religious rituals. At roughly 13 years of age, one learns to read the Torah in the original Hebrew. Um, and there's it's a huge celebration. My Jewish friends in middle school were very, very excited about going through this. Um, I always enjoy the very, very humorous depiction of this process in the film Keeping the Faith, where Ben Stiller is a rabbi who, alongside many of his other duties, is working very hard with some young students so they can really nail their Hebrew pronunciation. Um, and it's a really funny depiction, and it articulates some of the awkwardness that comes with being at this age and then going through this very public sort of presentation to the community that you have learned these skills and that you're growing up. So, all right, let's move on. Demographics. I think this kind of takes us to this question of Judaism as religion and or ethnicity. I'll talk about this a little bit towards the end of the presentation. But you may know, or you may yourself be, someone who identifies as Jewish, but not necessarily very religious. And traditionally, we've looked at Judaism as this intersection of religion and ethnicity. Now, the challenge there is that it's not as if Jews come from one place. We have these large populations in the US and Israel, approximately 15 million people. We have German or Eastern European descended Jews who identify as being Ashkenazi or the Ashkenazim. And then the Sephardim are more from Iberia or from southern Spain. And I'll talk a little bit later about a group of Jews, a community of Jews who are from Ethiopia. And we have populations in North Africa. And of course, Judaism is spread all around the world. So this question of ethnicity is fascinating because people might identify as being culturally Jewish, but they may or may not identify as being particularly religious. And there are people who identify as being Christian, but you might see them go to church, if at all, maybe on Christmas and Easter. And similarly, in all of these religious traditions, the way that we measure religious um, identity or membership in a religious community is very, very tricky. And as I'll talk about in some of the other presentations in this series, people like the Pew Research Group will measure things like attendance at synagogue or mosque or church or temple. And because it's very difficult to measure something that we actually oftentimes construct as an internal state of being, right? What do you believe? Um, and yet, how do we measure who counts as a member of a religious tradition? Um, so that I'll get into this in more detail later on, but I want you to hang on to that as a question. And perhaps you could pause here before going on with the rest of the presentation and think about in your own life, where do you see this combination of religion and culture, especially where the religion in question is in a minority position, right? What does that do in a country like the United States, where the majority of people identify as being Christian? Of course, there are many different denominations, which is the subject of the next presentation. But what does that do in terms of how people identify? Um, so you can reflect on that. Okay, sacred sites. A central kind of event or a central location for Judaism is the temple. We find it described as being built by Solomon and later expanded under King David. Then, when in the first century of the Common Era, when there is an open revolt against Roman colonial occupation in Israel, in ancient Israel, then the Roman army destroys the temple, which is a incredible trauma. As you can imagine, you have this central location, this axis mundi, if you will, and then most of it is razed to the ground. And this has a profound impact on the Jewish community, and this is where we see the rise of the rabbinate as an institution of scholars and teachers instead of the priestly class who was in charge of administering everything that went on at the temple. This picture is from the Western Wall. This is what's really left of, and this is believed to be one of the remaining sections, few remaining sections of the temple. It's also right next to a major Muslim site, the Dome of the Rock, Haram al-Sharif. And so, Jerusalem shares this religious history with, of course, Judaism, and then it's an important location in Christian history, and it's an important location in Muslim history. So sacred sites are one thing, and contested sacred sites are when you have multiple traditions who claim, or multiple communities who claim the sacredness of a site, then things get complicated. So we could consider what impact does it have on our perception, either as a member of a religious tradition or observing it from the outside, when it does have this specific connection, this rootedness to a particular physical location. Can you think of anything in, for example, very important sacred sites here in the US? What would some of them be depending on tradition? Are there quote unquote sacred sites within kind of American, what we might call civil religion? Sites that are important for people as part of affirming their identity as citizens of the United States, for example. That would be something that we could think about. Okay, let's move on. I like to do a slide on mysticism when I can, and Kabbalah is the name for that tradition within within Judaism. A key text here is the Zohar, which means like radiance, which is actually written in Aramaic. Um, Moses de Leon is credited as he claims he introduced the text, that he had discovered it, claiming it was written by a much earlier rabbi dating back as early as the 2nd century of the Common Era. But scholars today largely believe that Moses de Leon actually wrote the Zohar and then introduced it in 13th century Andalusia or southern Spain. Um, Coincidentally, there's a brand new edition of an English translation of the Zohar. I think it's something like 12 volumes, maybe more, including commentary of the entire text. And I'll have that listed in the additional readings. But within Kabbalah, we have this idea that we can meditate on the divine, or Ein Sof, that which is without limit. These Sephirot, these emanations of the divine. So maybe it's this idea of the divine crown, maybe it's the idea of the divine heart, that these emanations become ways to, we meditate on them, and those are ways to connect to God. There's this idea of framing, actually using language of love, and it's actually oftentimes quite erotic, thinking of the divine as this lover, and we are trying to connect to the divine with a passion and an intensity that is akin to the way that we would connect with our romantic partners, except it's much more intense because it's God. And we actually find that in mystical traditions across religious communities. So when I do my separate presentation on Sufism or Islamic mysticism, I'll talk about the Sufi sort of path of radical love, and you'll see some connections with what we have in Kabbalah. So I will go on. I wanted to talk about this community from Ethiopia. So they're known as the Beta Israel, or as the children of Israel. You may have heard of them referred to as the Falasha or the Falashim, and that now has taken on more of a derogatory name. Just to be clear, I just mention it because when I mention to other people there's these Jewish communities in Ethiopia, then they use that word, but it means sort of the dispossessed or the people who are wandering or without land. Um, and so the community itself, refers to itself as Beta Israel. So as early as I found records, as early as the 16th century, we have this rabbi actually in Cairo who issues a proclamation affirming the Ethiopian community as being descendants of the tribe of Dan, one of these 12 tribes of Israel. Over time, more and more of them have migrated from Ethiopia to Israel, and that actually is consistent with a lot of Jewish communities. Um, like, for example, when I was much younger, I studied in Morocco, which has a very long-standing Jewish community. And in the 20th century, there were these kind of waves of migration from Morocco to Israel that coincided with things like um, like during once the modern nation state of Israel was established, then, and there were these different wars between that modern state of Israel and its neighbors, such as Egypt and Syria and Jordan, where Jews in Morocco would migrate, and there was an effort, to gather um, Jews from around the world in Israel, right? This and the whole right of return of making Aliyah um, is a huge thing, and the Beta Israel again complicate this notion of religion and ethnicity, because then we have this like multiracial state that is Israel. And even pulling back from that, we can look at, sort of Judaism within the whole world. And we have Jews that are black, just to put it very plainly. And that isn't fitting with the mainstream conceptualization of Judaism. And yet we have thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews who are of African descent. Um, and that, I think, is an important thing for us to think about when we consider, what Judaism looks like. So, and this actually takes me to my next slide talking about anti-Semitism. And this, I think, is a main challenge that Jewish communities continue to face. Sadly, it has been going on for many centuries. Roughly 1 year ago, I'm recording this here in late July of 2020, but just over 1 year ago, there was a horrible shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, in which a gunman killed 11 people and injured, several others. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in the United States, restrictions on Jews joining, um, you know, community associations like country clubs or living in certain neighborhoods, being barred from holding public office, and many other forms of discrimination. Um, Anti-Semitism is a form of racism, which again, if we look at religion and ethnicity, we get very easily to religion and race. Um, some of the roots of this are this charge that kind of comes from the medieval period of blaming, quote unquote, the Jews for killing Jesus. Um, and as I say in my presentation that comes next on Christianity, that when you read the New Testament in the Christian Bible, it's the Romans that kill Jesus. That's all very clear because it was Jerusalem and the surrounding area was under Roman colonial occupation. Um, in the medieval period and moving forward, we have these periodic sort of pogroms or sort of waves of violence targeting Jews. Um, there were laws against Jews being able to own land, and so then there were certain occupations that Jews could engage in, right? And that included banking, and then that led to these horrible stereotypes about Jews and being greedy and just all kinds of things that frankly continue to this day. Um, there is one document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, sometimes just the Protocols of Zion, sometimes it's referred to as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It dates back to approximately 1903. That's a key sort of document of anti-Semitism that's completely fabricated, talks about it comes from Europe, and it's this conspiracy theory about Jews trying to take over the world and do all manner of horrible things. Um, Now, fast forward to September 11th, 2001, and there was this rumor that somehow starts circulating that no Jews died on 9/11. That all the Jews, they got some sort of secret message telling them don't go to the World Trade Center on that day. And there's a documentary on this called Protocols of Zion, the full listing and additional readings, and I really recommend it. It's not very long, and it's where the director, who is Jewish, Mark Levine, goes around. He really interrogates this claim and about the World Trade Center bombings, and then he or text, and then he traces it back through this, well over at that point, well over a century of this protocols of the elders of Zion, popping up again and again and again. And then, of course, we we have to talk about the Holocaust during the Second World War, where approximately 1/3 of the world Jewish population died. Um, that's an incredible tragedy. And if any of you have been to Washington, D.C., I know as I'm recording this, we're all under these various restrictions related to the coronavirus and the pandemic. But if you have the opportunity in the future to go to Washington, D.C., I highly recommend the Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a very powerful experience to walk through it, especially to listen to all of the testimonials that they've recorded from people who survived places like Auschwitz. Um, there are still people who deny the existence of the Holocaust, and this museum and others like it around the world really exist to provide the evidence that it cannot be denied and it should never be forgotten. There's another a book that I would recommend. It's listed by James Carroll. It's called Constantine's Sword. He argues that anti-Semitism is part of the West's cultural DNA, and he explains more in detail what he means by that in the book, which I would also recommend. Okay. All right, let's move on. Here in these additional readings, I've got a good mixture. Here, let me use the pointer. So here's the website for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Interestingly, they maintain a sort of a watch on genocide around the world. And so, for example, several years ago when there was this declaration of a genocide going on in Darfur, the western province of Sudan, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum published a lot of reports raising consciousness about it, calling for action. So, they are not just about the Holocaust in terms of what happened to Jews during the Second World War. They are really a leading advocacy organization to do everything they can to ensure that other ethnic and religious communities around the world don't share that same fate. When I had talked about Kabbalah, a major scholar of that is Gershom Scholem, and this is actually the second edition of Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. He was a scholar from Jerusalem who really investigated Kabbalah in great detail. Here's Mark Levine, who's the director of this Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Daniel Matz is the editor of this long, I think it's at least 12 volumes of the Zohar. Here is James Carroll with Constantine's Sword. The Yosef Yerushalmi Zachor book and then the David Bial edited volume are really good for looking at the diversity of Jewish communities over time. And one that I recommend in part because of a somewhat personal connection to it is Stephen Bloom's book called Postville. So Stephen Bloom is a journalism professor at the University of Iowa. And Postville is the story of when he and his family moved from California in the Bay Area to he gets this job at the University of Iowa, Iowa City in Iowa, kind of in eastern Iowa. And he hears about this Orthodox Chabad Lubavitcher community that has taken over a slaughterhouse, a meat processing facility in Postville, which is a very rural town in Iowa. And you could describe it as, you have this sort of mostly Christian, very, sort of rural white community in Postville, and then all of a sudden you get this influx of mostly Eastern European Orthodox Jews and they're living side by side, and as I like to say, cross-cultural hijinks ensue. And part of his culture, part of his religion. It's a wonderful story, though, talking about um, Jews moving from, in many cases, large urban areas and living in this very rural part of the country, which I have a personal connection to because it's where I have many, many, many family members, not in Postville specifically, but other parts of Iowa. And it's written in a very accessible way, and there's also a documentary attached to it. So, okay. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this very, very short introduction to Judaism. I'm sure as you were listening and watching, you thought of a million different things that I could have covered. Um, but I hope that perhaps there were one or two things that you hadn't thought about or didn't know about. And thank you so much for listening. And I hope that you enjoyed it and that hopefully you'll listen in and watch and listen to the other presentations in our series. Thank you so much.